I guess while we're waiting for that noon hour to get totally ripe, this is Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month here in Utah. So we do have a lot of events like this Zoom event going on across the month. We are this or pre-recorded so that we can keep everyone healthy and safe during these coronavirus strange times. So, all right, I think we can go ahead and get started. How are you guys feeling?
Doing well.
All right.
Feeling good.
Excited. Thank you guys for being here, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for the second half of the Indigenous Knowledge event. In the first half, you heard the conversation with Kristina Young and Jim Enote, and a wide-ranging conversation about ecology and Indigenous ways of understanding the world in general and how we can communicate and mediate across those. Just going to give a few introductions here and then give you a little bit of a scope about where I think our conversation might go, but we do have an hour, and so we can range topics really widely. And if you are tuning in on live via YouTube or Facebook, you can always tweet your questions at us or email them at ehora@utah.gov. You can tweet using the hashtag Indigenous Knowledge. You can also use that hashtag on Facebook. We have some of our helpers at the Utah SHPO who will be giving those questions to me so that I can read them on air to Jim and Kristina. You might as well be in the hot seat too. So quick introductions. In case you don't know me already, I'm Elizabeth Hora. I am public archaeologist at the Utah SHPO. Although we are located in Salt Lake City, we do try to get across the whole state. Right now I'm midway in my home, as a lot of us are. But since it is Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month, we want to make sure that we are getting people all across the state included in our events. And we're excited about this event because it opens it up a little more regionally. Next, I'm going to introduce Kristina Young. She is an ecologist and plant-based science communicator studying the semi-arid ecosystems of the Colorado Plateau. She lives in Moab currently. She is host and co-producer of Science Moab, the radio show that I hope that you're just getting off of right now. It's also a podcast in case you missed it. You can listen again on KZMU, or you can listen to Science Moab via your favorite podcast vehicle. And this podcast really embodies her desire to engage local communities like Moab with regional dryland science. She does a fantastic job. Been hosting that program for a couple years, right?
3 years.
Very cool. And our special guest today is Jim Enote. He is a Zuni tribal member. He is CEO of the Colorado Plateau Foundation, and he serves on the boards of the Trust for Mutual Understanding and the Grand Canyon Trust. He is also a National Geographic Society explorer, a New Mexico Community Luminaria, and an E.F. Schumacher Society Fellow. Jim was formerly the director of the Ashiwi Awan Museum, where he was awarded the first ever Ames Prize for Innovative Museum Anthropology by the American Anthropological Association, something that I know a lot of archaeologists who might be listening take very seriously. We all love the AAA. He was also awarded the Guardian of Culture and Lifeways Award from the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. So Kristina and I are absolutely delighted to have Jim here with us today to expand on their Science Moab conversation. And I am getting some word that the video is not live on Facebook. It's currently only viewable on YouTube. So if you do go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Utah SHPO, there should be a link there that you can click that will take you to YouTube Live. All right, and with all of that out of the way, thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you so much for participating in this experimental medium.
Well, thank you for the invitation. This is, I've been on several Zoom meetings before, of course, and this is, I think you're taking it to the next level. So Elizabeth, thank you very much. We'll see how this goes.
We'll see how it goes. And if it goes well, I really hope that we can continue having these kinds of conversations live over Zoom. It's not the same as being in the same room, but you know what? We'll do what we can.
Well,
So,
it's all about innovating, right? This time more than ever, we have to innovate.
well, and on that note, I mean, I kind of do want to jump in, I guess, to the strange times that COVID-19 pandemic is putting on us all. And as an archaeologist, when we look back in time, we can see evidence of pandemics, evidence of disease in the past. And, you know, particularly you think of like the Black Plague, we have that pretty well locked in. But I haven't heard a lot of stories or a lot of ways of knowing from Indigenous communities about how you access this knowledge of past pandemics that we all know have happened. So can you talk a little bit about that and about how you would come to know and how you can, you know, be a good vessel for that knowledge?
Sure, I can try. I obviously wasn't around a long time ago, 500 years ago. But ironically, my family name, Enote, which most people pronounce as Enote, but Enote in Zuni language means a long time ago.
Oh, wow.
And well, it became my family name. But I was very fortunate to have been raised by my great grandparents through until I was 17. They passed when I was 17 years old, and they lived in the 1800s and the 1900s. So I am fortunate to be maybe one of the last generations to have really spent time and lived and listened and learned from people that were living in the 1800s. And they were very lucid about what they heard from their great grandparents, who were probably living in the 17 and 1800s, and who that's so much of a stretch that they heard from their great grandparents, who may have lived in the 1600s and so on. So that oral history is, I think, quite lucid and very clear. I mean, when you think about our cultures here in this region in the Southwest, we didn't have a written language until just recently, using an international phonetic alphabet. But really, it's been about clarity and passing things on from generation to generation with real precision. And I mean, I'm convinced of that, how precise and clear this kind of transmission is. And I was giving like a side story here is that at Mesa Verde one time we were at looking, myself and some Zuni, we were looking at some things in the museum, in the collection center at Mesa Verde. And we looked at some things and we said, oh, those are not Zuni, those are not Zuni. Those look like Acoma, those look like Hopi. And we said, oh, these are Zuni. And the staff said, how do you know? And we said, because we still make them exactly the same way. And these were made, 700, 800, 900 years ago. And so there's some things that are very consistent, how things are made, how they're tied together, how they're painted, but also the directions and what things, it's like that, the word is passed for generation very clearly. People say, listen to what I'm telling you and don't change it. Just listen to what I'm saying so you can tell someone else. So that's just kind of laying a preamble for that. But I've heard from people like recently here in Zuni about the pandemic that we're all facing, right? And I had a physician also speak with me recently here who is at the Zuni hospital, and he was terrified because people were still meeting in kivas, people were still coming together in cultural, religious gatherings, and he was just afraid of what could happen. But listening to some of the religious leaders, and I'm not revealing anything sacred or that I shouldn't be, but what they said was that, yes, we may lose some people, but our commitment to maintaining the cosmological process is stronger. And that in the past, they've said a long time ago, it was the same, that when things happened, when things came through the villages, it was important to not be afraid, but instead to be smart. That, be careful and sometimes distance yourself from other people. So this was a long time ago. They were saying this, that they would see people getting sick, so they would kind of spread themselves out. and maybe go to like a satellite village, or as even similar to like the 1800s, 17, 1600s, those kind of refuge kind of villages. And so they would do that then. It was like spread out and be smart, and don't be afraid. So our peoples throughout the region have suffered through these things before and have lost people. But I think the more important thing was, like, the message was, don't be afraid, be smart.
Mhm.
And that if you're afraid and scared, then you're more susceptible. If you're anxious, obviously we know that too. If you're anxious, if you're stressed, you're nervous, you're more susceptible to being sick. Because if you're anxious and scared and nervous, you don't sleep well.
Right.
And when you don't sleep well, if you only get 4 hours and 6 hours of sleep, you wake up feeling lousy and you feel like you're going to get a cold, you get the runny nose kind of a thing. So it's important to be not afraid.
It's just so hard because we are such social animals, and the very act of distancing puts people ill at ease, you know? I think it's tough anyway.
Yeah, it is. But, I think that commitment that people have to maintaining our cosmological process, as I said, like, um, we may lose some people, but
Yeah.
but we have to be sure that the sun comes up, that winter becomes spring, that spring becomes summer, that the water will flow, and hopefully rain will come. That is more important than just me or you or a few other people. That collectively we have to maintain that, and we should not be afraid.
So when people do take on that important task of gathering together to make sure that life does move on and life does continue, do they become sort of heroes the way that our doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals are today, because they're putting themselves in harm's way for something that's larger for themselves? Particularly in Zuni, do people sort of view it in that way?
Well, first I'd say the first part of your question is like to maintain life that way, but it's not just life. It's like everything. Like I said, a cosmological process. It's for the fertility of all beings. It's for the sun to come up, for seasons to change and continually change. That's what's being maintained. As far as feeling like heroes and being elevated to an elite kind of level,
Yeah.
not so much, not so much. But I mean, that's maybe another question. It's a side spin-off question. Is about building elitism in communities. But just to answer that question about being heroes, when people don't really think of themselves that way, it's just like that is their job. That's their commitment uh, in the whole scheme of things, is to help maintain it.
Yeah. You had mentioned in a piece that you wrote about COVID-19 that we reject a return to normal. I'm sort of wondering, you mentioned, raising people on platforms like that could certainly become a new normal here pretty quick. But so the normal that you were referring to was, we don't necessarily want to return to a new normal because that normal was out of balance. And my question is, how can knowing the past help us to find the right normal that we should continue into the future?
Knowing the past, well, I'll first speak of like my own past, my own history, which is relatively speaking not very long. But one of my earliest memories as a young child was holding my mother's hand and her clenching it very tightly. And I looked at her and she was crying. And that was because we were standing in front of a whites only public restroom.
Hmm.
And so even well, that was like in early 60s, maybe 61 or 62 or 63, but ironically it was also just outside of the Air Force Base where my father was serving this nation. And that was, that's something that still sits with me. And that tells me, yes, that in my lifetime, in my history, in history of this nation and the world, things were not right. That was not good, but that was normal then.
Yeah.
And later, we hear about different kinds of discrimination or harassments, different things, and the Me Too movements. Well, things are just additively changing because of things that were normal then, we know were not necessarily good. So when I say that I'm not looking towards a return to normal, everybody is talking about can't wait to get back to normal. I think normal was not good for many of us, particularly marginalized people and others. So I think that with the COVID-19, and I think many things, maybe going way, way back in history, like people survived some of these pandemics in the past, 100 years ago or thousands of years ago, that I think that when they passed, it was a huge moment. We've survived it, that we've dispersed, but now we've come back together again and we're okay. We survived that. And now what's the new? How do we start? What's the new starting line?
Yeah.
What were the lessons learned from that? And I think that's just part of the human experience. So people have dispersed and come back together, and in a long time ago, and it was for the better. It makes people stronger.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe just having a little bit of mindfulness as we do return to some normal.
Something new.
Yeah, something new, that we can really be the authors and really craft this ourselves. Maybe we haven't. Maybe we've been letting things get pulled out of control a little bit, but we are ultimately the makers of our own destiny, I guess.
Yeah, well, we have national, international, global things going on, and we have silos, societal silos, and in some places they're not going to change, and some places I think there will be a major shift.
Mm-hmm.
In economies, look what we're doing right now is Zooming, using this Zoom. And my hope, and I was speaking to some Dartmouth students yesterday, and I said, I hope that this technology will be something that will bring more inclusiveness to our conversations. Let's maybe the silver lining on this is that it leads to more inclusiveness and involving more people. Of course, there's some issues around digital democracies and access and like bandwidth and all of that, but maybe it could be as in archaeology, as people are maybe going out to visit a remote site on a mountaintop or in a canyon, and some of the people from a community, some native peoples from whatever, Zuni, Hopi, and other communities, they can go with the archaeologists there. But wouldn't it be great if we had a satellite link to other elders who didn't have the physical capacity to visit those places, so that maybe 1, 2, or 3 people from the community are with the archaeologist visiting a site, and it gets transmitted back to the community where other elders can look at it and participate in those visits and those conversations. So like maybe this is, again, part of this new starting line, whether it's inclusiveness and democracy or technology, that we can use this for something good.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I know that in my own work here as public archaeologist, I've been connecting with a greater diversity of people across the state and across the region, like you, Jim. And in part, that's because I have to sit at my computer all day, and everyone has to sit at their computers all day. And whereas normally I would go out into the world and I would interact with people who were physically around me, and I would have connections with those same people again and again, I'm now able to collaborate with a wider cross-section of people. And I do want to talk a lot about collaboration, because I know as a museum director, that's something that you dealt with a lot. And it's something that as an archaeologist, we're just starting to tap into. And when we were talking with Kristina a little bit before we started airing, she was talking about how scientists in her orbit are starting to key in to this idea of collaboration, particularly with, in the archaeological sense, descendant communities and Indigenous descendant communities within that. So in the museum world, it looked like, from what I have read, maybe you were finding a lack of true collaboration. And that does seem very much like how we proceed in archaeology, where we're categorizing places and we're categorizing objects that are using systems that were developed a long time ago and continue to be developed, but with very little to no Indigenous input. So, maybe using something like our new digital world, do you have any advice for how we can start to collaborate with descendant communities? And this is a purely, this is something personal for me because I'd like to know how I can better collaborate with Indigenous communities.
The first thing is like collaboration is we have to be careful not to use it too cavalierly.
Yeah.
It's there are a lot of buzzwords out there, and whether we're collaborating or not really is something that needs to be put to a test. Maybe we should all give ourselves a kind of test. Are we really collaborating or not? And because I see collaborating as really something that's built around some mutually agreed upon outcomes. So it is really a co-laboring and a co-elaborating experience. And so I think that, this technology it's certainly something we pull out of the toolbox, and we're using it more now, but it's still not going to replace the face-to-face kind of communications. And like going to a site, for example, or going to a museum and handling collections, like hefting them and saying like, oh, this pot is a lot lighter than this other pot. So that tells me something. Or to look in the inside very carefully with a hand lens and see, well, there's some plant material in there. There could have been a solution in there, a potion of something with plants. So this might have been used for medicinal purposes, and therefore it might have been consecrated, and therefore it would be considered a sacred item, and would have different handling and treatment in a museum. So, but you can only do that when you're right there with those objects, with those things.
Yeah.
But in terms of collaboration, I worked on an effort with the School for Advanced Research and some other colleagues, and it's out there. You can find it if you go to the School for Advanced Research Museum Collaborations. I believe you might have to do a little, try a few different terms, but museum collaborations. And it was really written for how museums can collaborate with communities, source communities, and native communities, because a lot of people want to do the right thing, and people are getting more hip to this, right?
Yeah.
30 years ago, it was very hard to get a foot in the door to work with museums. They were very staid. They had their fit in the box orthodoxies, and they always wanted to know what were my credentials, what was my research going to be about. And I was like, hey, we just want to see what you have. Do you have Zuni things? And we want to know what condition they're in, and so on. It was so difficult, but NAGPRA helped change that. But the other thing is, 30 years ago, those people are retired. They're gone. And we have a new wave of workers in the field now. So that's something that I think to me, it's uplifting, that some of that old school, those attitudes and ways of doing things are just by a natural attrition of people retiring, moving out, that's changing. It leaves room for improvement there. But the collaborations, you have to make it true and real valid what collaboration is. And it should be reciprocal. It should be not just an extraction from a community or an individual. There has to be something in it for them. Otherwise, you're going to get some kind of like a relationship or survey tiredness, where people are going to be like, Elizabeth is calling me again to do something for her.
Yeah.
Whereas, I have, just like everyone else, I have deadlines, I have clients maybe, or I have maybe fundraising targets I need to meet, things like that. So there should always be a two-way street if you're going to really build collaborations, because collaborations is co-laboring and co-elaborating.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I definitely hear it. I think in archaeology, we it's almost like entropy, right? Like you said, people are really hip to this idea of collaboration, and that you need to get everyone together at the beginning when you're designing your research so that everyone is truly collaborating, that you're working together, that you have mutual goals that you've agreed upon. But it's so rarely practiced, at least that I've seen. And maybe it's more widely practiced in academia, which I'm a little bit out of that loop these days. I work in government, and a lot of what we do just has to be, this kind of like rote, we go out, we survey, we turn in the report, blah, blah, blah. Or we go out, we identify something that is eligible for the National Register. We survey the tribes, like you said, and we say, hey, is this a thing to you? And then, we're like, well, no one said anything back. I guess we'll just write our own thing.
Yeah.
And so this is a little far maybe out of your own wheelhouse, but I think there's probably there's some parallels to the museum world. Do you have any maybe experiences with how you've helped people get onto the right path here that we could here in Utah put to use? Again, selfish question.
Yeah, and well, I was just up in Utah, and there's some wonderful places that are working in heritage, archaeology, cultural resource, public lands, all of these things. There's some great organizations out there. And I have worked for state government, I've worked for federal government, I've worked for tribal government, I've worked for myself. But I'll tell you, I think one of the big changes that I'm seeing happening in the past 25 years, especially, is the growth of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and nonprofits. And not everyone is a good fit for government. I worked for government for quite a few years, but I just found it wasn't my fit. It's for others. It is a good fit. There's standards, and there's certain processes, and it works well for them. And others, it's not a good fit. So I think what's emerging now is more nonprofits and NGOs that are working cultural resource work that don't have the kind of maybe restraints, budgeting issues, bureaucracies and such, or even the technocracies that might exist in government. And so I can see something growing out of this is maybe more attention and more happening in the NGO and nonprofit field when it comes to archaeology, cultural resource, all of these things, including public lands and protection of public lands. It's the nonprofits, it's people coming together.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean they're just a bunch of hippies that want to do some cool stuff. Many of them are just, they may have come out of scholarship, they may have come out of government, but they just want to do things slightly different. And I think that just broadens the spectrum of the ways that we're going to address some of the world's most complex problems.
Yeah, I know for my own, work, speaking from state government, I would love to be able to partner and pair with NGOs who have a little bit more freedom, because a lot of what we run into is timeline. It's often hard for us to communicate with people that, like we said earlier, we're not always seeing every day, just because we have tight timelines and we've got to turn stuff around really quickly. So if we had people in an NGO community, that would be fantastic, who could take the ball and run,
Yeah, I think that's going to be part of the future.
Yeah.
And I'm not disparaging government. I worked in government, and I have a lot of respect for quite a few people in government. It just wasn't a fit for me.
Oh, I get it. It's not a fit for everyone. It is for me, and I definitely love it. But yeah, it has its own challenges. So we do have quite a few questions from folks who are online, and I do want to just remind people, if maybe you're tuning in right now, that you can tweet with the hashtag Indigenous Knowledge. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and give us your questions, obviously on YouTube as well. So I do have a couple of questions. It's going to get pretty wild and woolly here, though, guys. You cool with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So Craig Childs, I think probably speaking to you, Kristina, and to you, Jim, says you brought up policymakers seeing other kinds of knowledge as anecdotal knowledge. And I know that this rings really true in archaeology, I think, too. It feels like policy can be cold, heartless by design almost, with little room for artful or even thoughtful approaches? Can the sacred become part of policy without being diminished? So when you said you were seeing changes, opening our policy opening to knowledges, can you give a hopeful example of that? So it's a big question.
No, that's, I mean, it is, that's a good time for that kind of question. Because, for example, there are the national monuments, of course, and public lands that are under threat. And it's, I mean, how do you, it's several years ago, actually, I worked on some work with a friend, and we were doing work internationally about sacred mountains. And we were visiting sacred mountain, well, national parks in different countries around the world. And many countries were quick to embrace the idea of sacredness and mountains. And we found, and then maybe 20 years ago, going to some national parks to talk about sacredness and mountains, and National Park Service folks were like, whoa, we can't get into that.
Yeah.
There are so many different, religions and beliefs and things that we don't want to get into it, and we have separation of church and state. There was all kinds of reasons that the parks were trying to avoid bringing sacredness in there. But I think that now, again, with new generation of workers, whether it's the parks or other public land agencies, I think people are starting to realize that there's something to sacredness as a means to conservation and even development and protection. That public lands, for example, and like Bears Ears is another example, especially, are places that are the original source of the world's medicines. We may not think of it now, but there are things there, just like may have been like a forest somewhere around the world, or other parts of other ecosystems around the world that were, much of the world's medicines originated from those places. And so there's something sacred about that. And I believe also that some lands are really, there's a big part of identity in these lands, public lands and others, that there's identity there. And there's also solace, and so in this time when we're hunkered down in our houses, and we were talking about this earlier, when people are nervous and they're anxious, they're on this precipice. We're all on this kind of sort of feeling like we're on a precipice, standing on a precipice. But when you go out to some of these lands, when things start to relax a bit, we can go to these lands. It's a place of solace. So I think, again, this new starting line, again, all these things that we can bring to this, I can see sacredness as a means to some new policy. But it's going to be a new generation of people in policy, in governments. But I think that can be nudged. For example, I think, again, getting back to nonprofits, NGOs, in philanthropy. In philanthropy, where there's billions of dollars being put into some of the work around the world, around public lands, conservation, climate change, all this sort of things, and heritage museums. In philanthropy, people are saying, the time's up, that we can, with our grant making dollars, say, like, if your organization is not following ideas around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, then we're not going to give grants to you. Mm-hmm. We're going to support organizations that get it. And I think so things can be nudged in that direction towards policy. And it can be coming from individuals, from tribes, from nonprofits and NGOs. But I think that there's something there in the future. Yes.
Yeah, I think also in archaeology and in cultural resource management, we have a really powerful tool at our disposal that here in Utah we haven't used a lot, and that is the designation of traditional cultural properties. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, that for an area that has that sacredness, like if you were in, was it Mesa Verde that example was, where the NPS folks felt like they had to back off? Traditional cultural properties are a great way to designate those areas as important or special or sacred in a way that policy implementers then need to take into account and consideration. And those are usually good, true collaborative measures where you do need to have stakeholder input right at the beginning. We only have one here in the state of Utah. Rainbow Bridge is our only traditional cultural property on the books. And we're getting a second one, most likely. That'll be the Hole in the Rock Trail, sort of between Bluff and Escalante.
Yeah.
But,
well, but I'm going to get back to Craig's question a little bit too, that, it's so whether it's a museum or maybe a nonprofit organization, even a friends of a national park or forest and others, it's going to require also boards and trustees, because we have to address this at all levels of authority and influence. Not only their elected representatives, but also in other organizations that have boards and trustees, because boards and trustees make policy and monitor policy. So a staff can have wonderful ideas around, bringing sacredness into policy, but a board and trustee has to make that policy, monitor policy. So if organizations start building that kind of policy into theirs, it's going to eventually lead into, the language could be transferred and hopefully lead into governmental policy. But so right now, too many organizations are lockstep with government. I think it's time for the non-governmental sector to start influencing policy more. And as people get smarter and more clever about how to influence policy, that's going to happen.
Excellent. Okay, we have a question from Twitter that's regarding this conversation that we're having now. It's from @66routes. He goes by MCP. He says, Jim, do you find a double standard of sacredness versus the church-state separation in the government's dealing with native religions versus Christianity?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, in my lifetime, it's changing a bit. It was changing a bit depending on your location. But yes, definitely, there's always been that. From when I was younger, that performing ceremonies in some places at a museum or outside of a museum, or trying to go to a national park, things like that, or any kind of other public lands. Yeah, there was pushback on that, that it wasn't a recognized religion as people from the governments thought it was. So yeah, I've encountered that. Of course, the Native American Religious Freedom Act helped to change some of that. But I think, so this is relevant to that thing about not returning to a normal, because the Civil Rights Movement, Native American Religious Freedom Act, all of these things continually need to be defended. Sadly, that's like it's like the MO. It's like, why do we have to always be defending this? But that's what it is. And the makeup of the nation is slowly changing, and people are understanding. But we see regional, I think, again, these sort of silos, that regionally people, maybe in some areas, I don't know, Pacific Northwest might be more hip to it, whereas they may not be in the upper Midwest, or things like that. So it's certainly not a unified idea of respecting native religions versus, I don't want to say mainstream, but I mean the more recognized religions. There's a difference. There is definitely a difference. If we had some, the Pope and others, some bishops of other faiths, all good people and noble, I'm sure, if they were to come to some of the places that we were seeking to defend, I think that would make a difference.
Yeah.
But you have to build those relationships and build something around a collaboration, around a common cause.
I have another question from Eileen Quintana. She says, I am Danae, and my name is Eileen Quintana, originally from Denahotso, Arizona. I see how federal and state government has control over the sacred lands that rightfully belongs to Indigenous people. Bears Ears specifically, she says. We are not being heard about the lands where we have certain herbs growing, where we still make offerings to the mountains, where we hunt, and where we gather for certain rituals. We need to unite as tribal nations to push to keep our voices heard, and often we are viewed as militants. We see how Standing Rock has played out, and Eileen asks, what is your advice in this situation? Thank you, Eileen.
All right, Eileen, I think, well, one is obviously you're gathering information, listening to people, because you want to have as much information as possible if you have a campaign for anything. And so that you're in the know, you know what you're talking about, because people otherwise they view you as, you're right, you could be a militant. If you're only going there to say, stop something, don't do this, people say that's very narrow. And because the opposition or other people are going to say, well, you haven't talked about this, you haven't mentioned this. So I think being fully informed about the reasons for and against is very important. That's one thing, and that helps to shape your message and how you communicate, and how people, and whether people listen to you or not. I mean, there's kind of sometimes a magic or even sleight of hand at messaging. And we've seen it on television and radio and such, but there are ways to do some really solid messaging. But the first thing is to be knowledgeable. The other is, I think that, believing in yourself, of course, having the strength and knowing that I think that we are, we'll talk about this later maybe, that we are not a generation of sufferers, that we are a generation of nation builders. So that if we are defending Bears Ears, it's not because we think we are suffering, but it's because we want to build a better nation. That the place is important to all of us. And that for Native people, we have a place there. I mean, we have an important place there. And I think so, it's again about expanding this idea and messaging. I was speaking to some people recently about protecting Bears Ears. And I told them that, that place is a library of knowledge, is over hundreds, if not thousands of years. As I said before, it's a place where many important medicines have come from over the years. It is a place that has really contributed to the human experience and is an important part of this nation's history. And it should not be denied to your grandparents. I'm sorry, to your grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on, the generations in the future. Your generations in the future should not be denied this beautiful place. So there's a lot of messaging, but certainly that I think as far as Native people go, that's where I go for solace. That's where I go as part of my identity. That's where I go where I know there's medicine.
Okay, and
I'm with Eileen.
And I just want to add, as someone who is an agency person, I do work for the state of Utah. We want to keep having conversations, not just about Bears Ears, but about everything. Like you were saying, Jim, there's so much more that we can be talking about. And when we do start talking more, we get comfortable with each other more, and we learn the true hearts and minds of the people that we're talking with, that's the foundation for real collaboration going forward. I've got the tools at my disposal that I do, like TCPs, but there should be no lack of creativity. And like you were saying, Jim, we can make new policy. That's something that's in our ability to do as people.
Yeah, we have to be smart. We can make new policy. It may take some time, as I've said. Museums didn't change. NAGPRA didn't come about in 5 years. It's been, like I said, my great grandparents were talking about things that were happening in the 1800s and 1900s. They said that wasn't right. Things were not right. I experienced the whites only public restrooms as a young child. That's not right. but it's taken this long to get where we are at. So we can't go backwards. We can't go to that old normal. We have to continually keep that. We have to keep the inertia, but we have to keep working to make it better.
Yeah.
Yeah, and be listeners, and just we were talking about like this sort of reciprocal idea of like what's in it for you, what's in it for me. That we're sharing this place. We're all sharing this place, and but I don't want to say that I have only my view and this is the only way it should be. I want to present this as like I understand you, I hear you, I'm listening, and let's see if we can come to some consensus. But most of all, it's like you're listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll try to do that more, and I hope we'll just lead by example. And not to sound like a terrible listener, but can I take this in a totally different direction? Because we do have some other questions.
Let's do it.
We have Keshi Jim from Arizona, I apologize, asks, can you share with me the relationship of our Zuni ancestors with people of South America?
Some that, there's, I should say too, that as you heard the radio piece about different knowledges, right? Before this conversation. And Kristina and I were talking about knowledges and what is accessible and what isn't accessible. And so I wouldn't share, I'm not going to share what I'm not supposed to share. I mean, that's something unique about our peoples also, is that we have some things that we keep to ourselves. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation too.
Yeah.
Because why? But, oh, geez, a long time ago, that's a good way to start. A long time ago, that the people here, the Zuni people, were moving all throughout the Southwest. There were greener pastures, moving, trying to find the middle place, looking for a middle place. And I'm just abbreviating this because it's like it's an all day and all night narrative. But the people were looking for a middle place, the center, the right place, and moving to what is, for example, what is now parts of Utah, what is now parts of Colorado, parts of Arizona, just moving around. And they finally settled where we are now in this valley at Zuni. But also there was a place where they encountered a couple of eggs. And there was one that was brightly colored, and there was one that was very dull colored. And the people encountered these eggs, and there were two different groups that found these eggs. One group chose the colored one, and the other group chose the one that was dull colored. And they nourished them. They took care of these eggs. They nourished them. And as those eggs started to hatch out, the one that was dull colored started to emerge from its shell and was brightly colored. It had feathers that were blues and yellows and reds, and it was really bright. And it came out, and the people nourished it and took care of it. And then finally, when it started to fledge and started to fly, it started flying south. And that group of Zunis, started following it. And they followed it south. And they never returned, as far as we know. The other group that chose the colored egg, it hatched out, and it was a crow. And they were feeding it their own food, and it now has the same as an appetite for human food. And it stayed with them. It stayed with us. But the people that went south, the Zunis that went south and didn't return, we think that they went to a place that has an everlasting summer. And I went down into Central America back in the early 80s. I remember just reading some magazine, maybe a National Geographic, or I don't know what it was, but I saw a magazine that had these images of like plumed serpents and and other things that looked familiar to me. I said, that's Zuni.
Yeah.
We still have those ceremonies. They're still active. And I said, wow. So I saved up a little bit of money, and I got a flight to Houston and another flight to where was it? To Cancun, I think. And then I hitchhiked over to Chichen Itza, hitchhiked over to Uxmal, hitchhiked down to, I took a bus down to Belize City, and then I hitchhiked to Tikal. And there in the jungles were these huge carvings of plumed serpents and other images that made me think, Shazam, that is us. I mean, we are slightly different, but my feeling was that the blood that's in their veins is in my veins. There's something there. There's something there lasting. And I talked with people there about them, some of the Mayan people in the area. They said, this was a long time ago. Those people are gone now. And so it made me feel grateful that, what we have here at Zuni and with tribes in the Southwest, many of the tribes in the Southwest, we've still have that. And probably, maybe because we live in a very arid area, we're not near any major rivers for commerce transportation like the Missouri or Mississippi rivers. We're certainly not near any coast where there's ports.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of railroads crisscrossing this region.
Nope.
And so relatively speaking, we were left alone, until certain minerals were discovered. And of course, people moved in and wanted to do other things with this land, but relatively speaking, we were left alone, and our cultures and the rest have remained largely intact. So I'm really grateful for that. So we do have a connection down to the people down south.
That's
a strong connection. There's more to it than that, but there's things that we just don't talk about. Because there's some things, I think in every culture, there are some things that you just want to not bring up again. If you were to go to the Holocaust Museum and ask to see some family archives, thinking that it's all public and accessible, you'll be declined, you'll be denied. Some things, people think that it's just best kept with family. There's some things in our families we want to keep to ourselves. Some things in our own personal relationships we keep to ourselves. There are some things in communities and cultures that we keep to ourselves.
Sure.
So it's like this pandemic that's going on. There's the beautiful and the dangerous. We're still having our ceremonies. We're still coming around. We're still together. That's the beauty, but there is some danger.
I understand. We have another question from Keshi Jim as well. They want to know, Kristina or Jim, are you aware of any ethnogenetic plants that are used by the people of the Southwest? And what they say is entheogen, and maybe I am not a good enough ecologist, so I'm trying to learn that word.
Kristina, take it.
I know, it's not I studied soil. That's not my forte, Jim. I'll pass that one back to you.
Okay, we're playing pass the ball. Well, I studied in university agriculture. My specialization was soils also. So I can tell you about Eritic ustic torifluvens.
I only understood the word fluvent in that.
Soil classification. But the question was, let me hear it again, was about medicinal plants? Is that what you're saying? Or what?
It was about plants that are used by people of the Southwest.
Just plants that are used by the Southwest generally.
That's the question.
Yeah, well, first thing obviously is, sustenance in terms of food.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's, I think the other question is, breaking this down, is in the past and now. Right,
I think that's right, because I know a lot about past plants, right? Sometimes we find medicine bundles, and we've had people who, of Indigenous descent who have been able to identify them and say, oh, this was someone who, was carrying this bundle around, and it was a little medicine cabinet. It was a full medicine cabinet that someone might just have when they're out on a trip. So
Yeah.
there's a lot there. There is a lot of modern research about it as well from the past. And I'm sure there's a lot that people can share elsewhere about plants used by different people now and throughout time. I think that's a huge question.
Yeah, well, in the past, of course, yeah, I mean, there were no supermarkets, there were no stores in the kind of trade that we see now.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to eat something other than an occasional rabbit or deer or turkey, then you were eating plants.
Yeah.
And so you obviously needed to know what was edible and safe and what wasn't. So, I mean, there's thousands of things that people would eat in the past, right?
Right.
So people were eating lots of plants, of course. And the other is really about how you use plants for making things, like your cordage, your shoes, your sandals, your baskets,
Right.
your ropes, all sorts of things. Is like how you use plants for that as well. And then how you use plants as part of ceremony. Plants are also clan symbols. People are clans of certain plants because those plants are so important. So in the past, yes, of course, we use lots of plants, all sorts of things, for food, for making things, and for medicine, of course. And so today, not so much. Not so much. A few people do.
Yeah.
But and those are valued people that still know those things. And in some cases, they have to be initiated into certain groups to be able to access that knowledge, like which plants to use for medicine. I think now, again, with this, with the pandemic and a new starting line, I think that we can see more around the idea of foraging. That let's go out and forage for something to eat, and not so much as just a hobby or something fun to do, but let's literally be thinking about what can we eat out there, what is safe to eat, and it's best to do it with people who know how, so you don't kill yourself. But the other thing is, I think, learning how to make things. I think once you're out there foraging and looking for things, you're also learning how to make things and how you use plants to make cordage and so on. But the medicine part, there's a few people that can do that. But I think this takes us back again to the question of lands and public lands and reservation lands and private, all lands really. But especially public lands, where those are places that we can learn from. That they're places of solace, yes. They're places of identity, of course. And as I said, places of some of the world's original medicines. But they are places that we can learn, that we can go out and be calm, reconnect to place, so that we can learn to become of this place and not just an occasional visitor. And that we can learn something there. We can learn what we can eat, learn what we can make from those plants and so on. So I'm glad to hear that question. That's a good one.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of, Kristina, you might want to chime in too. I think there's a lot of point of, a mutual understanding there, because at least from where I'm coming at as an archaeologist, and maybe Kristina as an ecologist, land is the classroom. Land is the laboratory. Land has everything to teach us,
We're very fortunate to be living where we live.
We are. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of, all of us, we have overlapping and we have different things that we're each doing, but we are all caring and rooted in this place and understanding it in our different ways. And I think that is the beauty of these kinds of conversations, and why I love talking to you both and so many other people who really deeply care and want to see this place flourish, the people and the natural environment. I think these conversations are important for that reason, and place really connects all of us. And I think that's really, really a special thing.
Well put. So, you know, maybe as we make a new normal, this can be a part of it, where we're able to talk more over larger, you know, expanses of area and get to know each other a little bit better. We have to end it now for today, though. So thank you guys so much.
You know, Elizabeth, you know, just while I'll let you close, but I think that this last question about the plants has just reminded me that, you know, one of the first things we learn as human beings, as people, is gathering some cordage and learning how to tie things together. And we can use that as a metaphor for this conversation and others, is like, how do we learn to listen and tie things together?
That's a very appropriate metaphor. I like that a lot. Might steal it.
Right.
So thank you guys so much. And, you know, thank you, Kristina, for your Science Moab program. You do great work. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks for making this event possible.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, so much for coming on. You are a wealth of knowledge on different ways of knowing, and we really appreciate hearing from you for the last hour. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
All right, well, we're going to sign it off, and thanks everyone who was able to tune in and join us. If we didn't get to your questions, I'm so sorry. We will try to find a way to answer them offline, but that's it for us for now. Thank you.